By March 3, 1943, a Japanese convoy of 8 transports and 8 destroyers was fighting through heavy seas in the Bismarck Sea, driving toward Lae, New Guinea. Tokyo believed those ships were protected by distance, bad weather, and one hard fact. The Americans had no weapon that could reliably wipe out a moving convoy in open water. Engineers agreed. A medium bomber stuffed with heavy machine guns, flown at wave-top height straight into Japanese anti-aircraft fire, sounded less like a plan and more like a mass casualty experiment. But in reality, over the next 72 hours, a handful of modified B-25 Mitchells, gunships no official design bureau had ever approved, would tear into that convoy, sink every transport, and force Japan to abandon daylight reinforcement runs to New Guinea. What the Japanese didn't know was that Paul "Pappy" Gunn, a U.S. Army Air Force's mechanic-turned-officer working out of dusty Australian hangars, had quietly rewritten the mathematics of naval warfare in the Southwest Pacific. By early 1943, the war in the Southwest Pacific had become a logistics race wrapped in jungle and ocean. Japan still held Rabaul, the great fortress base on New Britain, with airfields and harbors that seemed to dominate the approaches to New Guinea. From there, Tokyo wanted to push men and supplies into Lae and Salamaua on the northern coast of New Guinea to stop General Douglas MacArthur's advance. The Americans faced their own problem. The front line was thousands of miles from the American mainland. Every gallon of fuel, every bomb, every spare part had to cross the Pacific. The U.S. 5th Air Force, under Lieutenant General George C. Kenney, was outnumbered in the air and starved of modern aircraft. On paper, Japan should have held the advantage. They controlled the islands, they had interior lines, and they believed the convoys that ran from Rabaul to Lae were protected by bad weather, Allied inexperience, and the simple difficulty of hitting a moving ship from the air. In late February 1943, Tokyo authorized a major reinforcement move. 8 transports and cargo ships, loaded with roughly 6,900 men of the Japanese 51st Infantry Division, ammunition, vehicles, and supplies, would sail from Rabaul to Lae. Escorting them would be 8 destroyers, under Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura. On February 28, 1943, the convoy slipped out of Rabaul's Simpson Harbor, hulls painted dark for night operations, anti-aircraft guns manned. Kimura believed that with destroyer screens, aggressive air cover, and a route timed to exploit weather over the Bismarck Sea, they could thread the needle. Japanese intelligence did not rate the American air threat as decisive. High-altitude bombing by B-17S had been inaccurate against moving ships. Pilots had to guess where the target would be when the bombs fell. Too high, too slow to adjust. In their calculations, if the convoy kept moving, zigzagged, and hugged bad weather fronts, the Americans could not sink enough ships to matter. General Kenney had a different view. From his headquarters in Brisbane, he understood that Japan could not be beaten in the Southwest Pacific by counting fighter victories. The decisive target was shipping. Every transport that reached Lae meant more Japanese rifles in the jungle, more artillery pieces pointed at Australian and American troops. But there was a problem. High-altitude bombing wasn't working. The early experiments with B-17 and conventional B-25 against shipping had produced scattered hits, but no consistent ability to wipe out convoys. Kenney needed a way to turn his limited bomber force into a scalpel, something that could hit Japanese ships at close range, at low altitude, fast enough that the enemy gunners would be overwhelmed. That something came from a man who, officially, was supposed to fix airplanes, not redesign them. Paul "Pappy" Gunn had been a civilian airline pilot in the Philippines before the war, then a U.S. Army Air Forces officer. By rank, he was a major assigned to the 81st Depot Repair Squadron. On paper, his job was maintenance. In reality, he was an inventor in coveralls. Gunn had seen firsthand how vulnerable Japanese ships were when attacked low and fast. He believed that a medium bomber like the B-25 Mitchell could be transformed into a gun platform that didn't just drop bombs. It chewed its way through a convoy with concentrated forward-firing 50-caliber machine gun. In early 1943, inside dusty hangars in Australia, Pappy Gunn and his men began to tear apart perfectly good bombers. The standard B-25 carried a glazed nose for a bombardier and a handful of defensive guns. Gunn removed the glass nose entirely. In its place, he installed 4 fixed, forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns, aimed straight ahead. Then he went further. He added 2 more .50s on each side of the forward fuselage, mounted in pods below the cockpit, and additional guns in the lower nose. Depending on the configuration, some of these modified B-25s carried up to 12 heavy machine guns that could all fire at once directly ahead. In a dive or low-level run, this meant a river of lead smashing into a ship's bridge, gun mounts, and crew. To the engineers in formal channels, it was madness. A medium bomber was not designed to fly at 200 to 250 feet above the water, into the teeth of every gun a ship could bring to bear. Guns' modifications shifted weight forward, changed the aircraft's balance, and turned it into something the manuals had not contemplated. But in reality, Gunn and his ground crews were doing exactly what the war demanded, adapting American industrial products on the fly. The United States could mass-produce airframes and engines. In the Southwest Pacific, officers like Gunn could turn that mass production into custom-built weapons tailored to the local fight. Kenny saw the potential. Where others saw a maintenance nightmare, he saw a way to break Japanese logistics. He began pushing Gunn's Strafer B-25s into frontline units like the 3rd Bomb Group, pairing them with new tactics that would make full use of their firepower. While Gunn modified aircraft, other officers experimented with a new way to deliver bombs. Major William Benn of the 63rd Bomb Squadron had been working on skip bombing, a technique adapted from British attacks in Europe. Instead of dropping bombs from high altitude, crews would fly in at low level, release their bombs at high speed, and let the weapons skip across the water like stones before slamming into a ship's side. Combined with mast-height bombing, flying just above a ship's tallest mast and releasing bombs directly at the hull, this created a deadly combination. Kenny's concept was simple, brutal, and precise. First wave, high-altitude B-17S to disrupt convoy formations and force ships to turn. Second wave, low-level B-25 gunships to rake decks with machine gun fire, suppress anti-aircraft crews, and sow chaos. Third wave, skip bombing, coming in at wave top height to deliver bombs into the hulls. Instead of relying on chance, the Americans would turn the convoy into a geometry problem. If they could control altitude, approach angle, and timing, they could attack from multiple directions and heights at once, overloading Japanese defenses. By late February 1943, Kenny's 5th Air Force had a small but growing number of these modified aircraft and trained crews. What they needed was a target big enough to justify the risk. The Japanese convoy leaving Rabaul was that target. On February 28, 1943, Allied codebreakers and reconnaissance confirmed the convoy's departure from Rabaul. As the ships pushed into the Bismarck Sea, turning south and then southwest toward Leh, B-24s and long-range aircraft began to shadow them. Weather was the first enemy. Heavy tropical clouds, rain squalls, and low visibility made sustained contact difficult. For parts of March 1st, the convoy disappeared under cloud cover. Japanese commanders took that as confirmation of their belief. Weather and distance would shield them. But the Americans had something Japan lacked: a deep network of radar, coast watchers, and code breaking built on industrial-era signals equipment. By March 2nd, the picture sharpened. The Japanese convoy had been located roughly 100 miles north of Cape Ward Hunt, off New Guinea's northeastern coast. Kenny decided it was time to strike. Midday, B-17, flying fortresses of the 43rd Bomb Group went in from altitude, around 7,000 to 10,000 feet. They attacked from several directions, forcing Japanese ships to maneuver hard. Bombs splashed around the convoy, near misses throwing up columns of water. At least one transport was damaged. The real test, however, would come the next day, when Kenny unleashed his low-level force. Night fell on March 2nd with the Japanese still afloat, but shaken. They had seen heavy bombers above the clouds. They had not yet met the new kind of attack waiting just over the horizon. Admiral Kimura ordered the convoy to press on through the night toward Leh. To reduce the risk of air attack at dawn, he maneuvered his ships closer to the Huon Gulf and the New Guinea coast, hoping proximity to land and cloud cover would break up incoming raids. On the Allied side, Kenny and his staff in Port Moresby prepared for a coordinated strike on March 3rd. It would be a test not just of pilots and aircraft, but of the entire American way of war in the theater. Could intelligence track the convoy precisely enough to time multi-wave attacks? Could the modified B-25s survive the wall of anti-aircraft fire they were about to face? And could American pilots, many of them relatively inexperienced, fly into that fire at 200 to 250 feet above the water without flinching? In the pre-dawn hours, ground crews at forward airstrips fueled and armed the aircraft. Bomber bays were loaded not for high-altitude precision, but for low-level destruction. 500 and 1,000-pound bombs with delayed fuses for skip bombing, 50-caliber ammunition stacked in belts for the gunships. Some pilots, looking at the modified B-25s, still thought what many engineers had said. This is crazy. These planes weren't built for this. What they didn't know was that within 24 hours, the Japanese would be the ones calling it impossible. Impossible that a handful of medium bombers could wipe out an entire convoy. The morning of March 3rd, 1943, broke with patches of cloud and sun over the Bismarck Sea. At about 1000 hours, Allied reconnaissance confirmed the convoy's position north of Leh. The ships were still in relatively tight formation, 8 transports, 8 destroyers, steaming at around 7 to 10 knots. Kenny's plan unfolded like a machine. Shortly before noon, B-17S went in again at medium to high altitude, attacking from multiple directions. Their job was not to sink every ship, but to force the Japanese to turn, to scatter their formation, and to fix their attention upward. Minutes later, radar and observers reported anti-aircraft fire and evasive turns from the convoy. Columns of water from near misses disrupted the sea surface, making it harder for Japanese gunners to track low-flying targets. Then, from around 2,000 feet, a 20 Havocs and some B-25s dove in as intermediates, further confusing the picture. The decisive moment came when the horizon at sea level filled with specks, the low-level B-25s coming in at mast height. At roughly 200 to 250 feet above the waves, doing 220 to 230 miles per hour, they were below many Japanese gunners' depression angles until the last seconds. The ocean blurred by under their wings. In the cockpits, pilots and gunners could see individual sailors on deck, and when they pressed their triggers, all those forward-firing .50s spoke at once. As the first wave of B-25 gunships roared in, they concentrated on the escorting destroyers and anti-aircraft mounts. Japanese doctrine relied on these ships to put up a lethal curtain of fire. Guns concept flipped that logic. If you could stun or kill the gunners in the opening seconds, the entire defensive system collapsed. One after another, B-25s lined up along the length of Japanese ships, raking them from bow to stern with up to a dozen heavy machine guns. 50 caliber rounds smashed into bridge windows, gun shields, and exposed crews. Searchlights, signal lamps, rangefinders, delicate instruments that made a fire control system lethal, were shredded in bursts that could put hundreds of bullets on target in a single pass. Behind them, skip-bombing B-25s and A-20S followed. Using the chaos created by the gunships, they came in even lower, released their bombs at ranges as short as 500 to 800 yards, and watched them skip across the water into Japanese hulls. Within about 15 minutes, the convoy's fate was sealed. Transports were hit, listing, burning. At least one destroyer staggered out of line, smoke pouring from its superstructure. From the air, American crews saw something they had never witnessed at this scale: a full Japanese reinforcement convoy, carefully assembled and escorted, being torn apart in real time. What had begun, 72 hours earlier, as an exercise in cautious optimism in Tokyo, was turning, minute by minute, into a catastrophe. By the evening of March 3rd and into March 4th, the work became grim and methodical. Damaged Japanese ships were hunted down and finished off as they tried to limp toward Leh or turn back. Allied aircraft strafed lifeboats and barges carrying troops. A brutal but, in the logic of 1943, militarily decisive act. In total, over the 72 hours from first contact to the end of the battle, the Japanese lost all 8 transports and 4 destroyers. Around 3,000 troops were killed. Only a fraction of the 51st Division ever reached New Guinea's shores, many without weapons or supplies. Strategically, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea was a turning point. Japan could never again attempt a large reinforcement convoy to New Guinea in daylight with any confidence. The Imperial Navy shifted to smaller nighttime runs and submarines, slower, riskier, and completely inadequate to sustain the front line. For Kenny and his airmen, and for Papygun's impossible B-25s, it was proof that American industrial improvisation and tactical innovation could offset numerical inferiority and distance. Japan had believed weather and geometry would shield its shipping. The United States had replied by weaponizing geometry, altitude, angle, speed, and building a bomber that could do what the manuals said it shouldn't. And that changed more than a single battle. It rewrote how air power could strangle an enemy's war by going not after his frontline units, but after the ships that fed them. The sea around New Guinea was now littered with names that would enter staff reports as cold lines of text. But in those 72 hours, each ship was a specific target in the crosshairs. One of the first to die had been Kyokusai Maru, a 5,493-ton transport. On March 2nd, high-altitude B-17s had caught her straggling at the edge of the convoy and planted bombs close enough to break her back. She went down with hundreds of men aboard, a preview, not the main act. On March 3rd, it was the turn of larger ships like Teiyo Maru and Oigawa Maru. Gunship B-25s bored in low, their tracers walking up the hulls, hosing the decks where troops were standing in formation or clustered around gun positions and lifeboats. Behind them came the skip bombers. A B-25 of the 91st Bomb Squadron lined up on Teiyo Maru's port bow, released at mast height, and watched its bomb skip once, twice, then vanish in a flash against the ship's side. Seconds later, an orange fireball bulged from below decks as ammunition cooked off. From another cockpit, a pilot recalled seeing Oigawa Maru blow apart like a cardboard box, her midsection engulfed as she heeled over. On the destroyer Arashio, meant to guard these transports, damage and collisions added chaos. Maneuvering to avoid bombs and wreckage, she struck the crippled Oigawa Maru and was herself mortally wounded. Within the span of a single afternoon, what had been a careful column of 8 transports had become a string of burning, sinking wrecks, many of them dead in the water within 20 to 30 minutes of the first coordinated low-level attacks. On the bridges of the surviving ships, officers tried to impose order on the impossible. Admiral Masatomi Kimura, commanding from one of the destroyers, had to make an immediate choice: press on and risk losing every transport within range of Lei's coastal defenses, or break off and attempt a retreat under skies he no longer controlled. Radio traffic crackled with partial reports. Teiyo Maru hit, Kyokusei Maru sunk, heavy casualties. But the situation was changing faster than any signal system could track. Each new American wave seemed to come from a different direction, at a different height. Japanese doctrine had never solved this problem. Their navy had been built for decisive surface engagements and long-range torpedo attacks, not for convoys under continuous multi-altitude air assault. By the evening of March 3rd, Kimura ordered what ships he could save to retire. Destroyers like Asashio and Tokitsukaze tried to shepherd crippled vessels or pick up survivors, but retreat only made them targets for follow-up strikes on March 4th. Asashio herself was sunk by B-25s while recovering men from the water. In Rabaul, staff officers reading fragments of the incoming reports understood, even before the full tally was known, that something fundamental had broken. A Japanese convoy, escorted by modern destroyers, operating under what they thought was protective weather, had been annihilated by a mixed force of medium bombers and light attack aircraft. What they didn't know, yet, was that this was not a one-off disaster. It was the first clear demonstration of a new Allied doctrine that combined intelligence, industrial adaptability, and aggressive tactics in a way Japan could not match. In Port Moresby and Brisbane, General George Kenney read the after-action reports with the cool satisfaction of a man who has taken a calculated risk and seen it pay off. The numbers were stark. 8 transports sunk, 4 destroyers lost. Over 3,000 Japanese troops killed, many more scattered in the sea or washed ashore without weapons. No American ship losses and aircraft losses light compared to the scale of destruction inflicted. For Kenney, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea validated 3 ideas he had been pushing since taking command. Shipping was the real target. Knocking down enemy fighters day after day meant little if their convoys kept arriving. Medium bombers could be offensive weapons at low altitude, not just high-level delivery trucks. Field modification and decentralized innovation, embodied by Pappy Gunn, could move faster than formal procurement channels. In his post-war memoirs, Kenney would underline the importance of officers like Gunn, who made their own tools when headquarters wouldn't send them what the job called for. The U.S. industrial base allowed this sort of experimentation. Factories in the United States turned out B-25 airframes by the hundreds. In the Southwest Pacific, units could afford to pull some from standard rolls and turn them into custom gunships because more were on the way. Japan had no such margin. Their aircraft production strained to replace combat losses, with little room for radical redesign in the field. Where Gunn could strip a nose and bolt on extra .50s in weeks, Japanese units were locked into existing patterns and slower central approvals. After Bismarck Sea, Kenney didn't have to argue as hard. Requests for more modified B-25s, more training in skip bombing, and more emphasis on convoy interdiction in the Southwest Pacific now carried the weight of a proven victory. The Japanese reacted in the only way they could. Large daylight convoys to New Guinea and similar fronts effectively stopped. When reinforcements had to be moved, they went by destroyer at night, by submarine, or in small, fragmented groups, what Allied intelligence called the Tokyo Express style of supply. Each of these alternatives carried its own vulnerabilities. Destroyer runs burned precious fuel and exposed high-value warships to ambush. Submarines could carry only a fraction of a transport's cargo or troops. Small coastal barge convoys were slow, exposed to local air superiority, and vulnerable to interdiction by PT boats and fighter bombers. In effect, the Battle of the Bismarck Sea forced Japan into a logistical cul-de-sac. They could still fight savagely on the ground, but the flow of men, shells, and food to those battlefields never recovered to pre-Bismarck levels. For the Americans and their allies, the battle offered a template, the combination of accurate intelligence, flexible, modified aircraft, and aggressive, low-level tactics. It became a standard part of the playbook for the rest of the Pacific War. You can trace a line from the B-25 gunships over the Bismarck Sea to later A-26 Invaders, and, in the long view, to Cold War strike aircraft built to come in low, fast, and heavy against enemy logistics, from Soviet supply lines to truck convoys on other continents. In 1943, few of the men flying those B-25s were thinking about future doctrine. They were thinking about staying alive for one more pass, about the feel of the yoke trembling in their hands as the aircraft bucked under recoil, about the sight of a transport rolling over on its side. But in air staffs and war colleges, the lesson was clear. If you can choke an enemy's supply lines from the air, you can unmake his plans before his divisions ever reach the front. In the end, the story of Pappy Gunn's B-25 gunship is not about a single heroic pilot or a lucky strike. It is the story of how an industrial democracy at war could reconfigure its machines and its thinking faster than an authoritarian rival. A mechanic officer in a hot, dusty hangar could take a production bomber, ignore the rulebook, and give his commander a new weapon in weeks. Engineers had called the idea impossible. The aircraft wasn't designed for it. The manuals didn't cover it. The risk seemed too great. But in the Bismarck Sea, those impossible aircraft turned a Japanese convoy into wreckage in 72 hours. and forced Tokyo to admit that its assumptions about air power, logistics, and safety at sea were obsolete. The Japanese believed weather and distance would protect their ships. The Americans replied by turning weather into cover, distance into a targeting problem, and a bomber into a gun platform that made the sea itself unsafe. That is how wars are decided at the operational level. Not just by courage, not just by numbers, but by the speed at which one side can turn steel, fuel, and human ingenuity into a new way of fighting. And in March 1943, over the grey churning waters of the Bismarck Sea, the shape of that new way could be traced in the muzzle flashes of an impossible B-25 gunship, bearing down at mast height on a convoy that would never reach its destination.